U.S. top diplomat Marco Rubio says Washington wants to hear what concessions Kyiv is willing to make to achieve peace ahead of meetings with the Ukrainian delegation in Saudi Arabia.
The discussions in the Saudi port city of Jeddah comes at a critical time for Ukraine, which is seeking to repair strained ties with the United States. While relations between the two countries have fallen to their lowest point since the start of the war, following a contentious Oval Office meeting between Mr. Trump and Mr. Zelenskyy. The fallout has led to Washington announcing a pause on military aid as well as intelligence sharing with Kyiv. For analysis on the latest developments in the war, let's speak now to Allan Behm. He's Senior Advisor, International and Security Affairs Program at the Australia Institute. Allan, thanks so much for joining us. Good morning. I want to start by asking you about whether you think there's less daylight between both sides since that Oval Office fallout at the end of February. I mean, Zelenskyy is there, for example, but he's not attending the meetings and the talks at all.
Look, I think Ukraine is at the moment, Arnold, in a very perilous position. The United States made it very clear, I think, during that extraordinary meeting last week that it was not prepared to put any of its interests at risk in order to assist Ukraine. It has announced the pause in support that you've just mentioned. So in all of this, I think Ukraine is finding itself very much on its own and will have to think very deeply about the position in which it finds itself right now.
And does it seem at this point, Allan, that it's inevitable that Ukraine will have to consider some territorial concessions?
Look, I think it is now inevitable that Ukraine will need to make concessions. I remember being interviewed on your program when this conflict began 3 years ago, in which at that time I said that the best outcome was to negotiate a line of control, a ceasefire, and begin negotiations immediately on the status of the Russian-speaking areas to the east of Ukraine. A lot of time has gone past and a lot of opportunity has been lost, but I think the only outcome now can be a negotiated settlement, and Ukraine is in a weaker position now than it was 3 years ago. That, I think, is the reality of the situation.
So in that context, then, Allan, what would a successful peace process look to you?
Look, I think success is hard to measure here. For Russia, the success will be effectively to take all of the territory that it's already got, which really means taking the economic infrastructure of Ukraine as we understand it to be, particularly its industrial infrastructure, and incorporating that within Russia, leaving Ukraine with very little in the way of heavy industry. For Ukraine, I think that the outcome looks even bleaker in that without that heavy industry, it is going to have to rebuild its economy. So it is very difficult to see a way forward at the moment that would put Ukraine in anything other than a basket case position, or at the same time that leaves Russia in a stronger position than it was before it began its conflict in Ukraine.
Allan, reports are suggesting that the Ukrainian delegation will propose an aerial and naval ceasefire during the talks, which begin later today. One reason is simply because it's easier to implement. I mean, is this a feasible idea? Marco Rubio seems to be receptive, but will Russia be open to it, or will Moscow want to press on with the gains it's been making over the past few months?
Look, that's an excellent question, Arnold, and if I knew the answer to that, I would be on Rubio's team, I expect. I think that for Russia, it has no need at the moment to make much by way of concession, particularly since it would now understand that the Americans are not prepared to put much of their own position at risk. They're not going to go in and play hard for Ukraine. So I think that Russia will make very, very heavy demands. For Ukraine, the question is going to be how much is it able to concede while maintaining the basic infrastructure of a viable state? And I think that is an issue which will require very clear indications of support, not only from Europe, and I don't mean military support here, I mean economic support, but also long-term economic support from the Americans. And that, it would appear from Trump's conversation with Zelenskyy, is not going to be that forthcoming. Trump has made it clear that the Americans don't want to spend more money and that they would like lots of thank you notes.
And Ellen, Saudi Arabia's diplomatic involvement in these talks, what role do you think Riyadh is playing in this round of discussions?
I think Riyadh is playing a role of a kind of honest broker here. It's providing a kind of neutral table around which warring parties, and that's what they are. We've got to understand that this is a war and that we have warring parties seeking to work out how they can tone down the energy of the war and move towards some kind of armistice or some kind of peace. It looks to be a very difficult thing to achieve. I don't believe, for example, that either Russia or America would be keen to have UN involvement, for instance. So what kind of monitoring arrangements could be negotiated is very difficult to tell from this distance. I think what the Saudis are offering, though, is a very important way of moving towards a breakthrough, and it will just take a lot of care on the part of Rubio and Lavrov to come to a basic set of rules which will allow Ukraine to survive and Russia to get on with being what Russia wants to be, which is the dominant power of Eastern Europe.
Allan, I want to just quickly go back to the point you were making about what Trump wants, as far as Ukraine is concerned. Thank you notes, perhaps a Nobel Peace Prize as well, and no boots on the ground. But I'm wondering if it's accurate, as some of our earlier guests have said, that he really has no interest in Ukraine. But if he can get a deal, maybe a minerals deal or more, then he might be interested.
Yes, I think Trump always talks about a deal, and eventually he will settle for a deal. And it may not be as ambitious a deal as he seemed to suggest in his, as I mentioned, that very difficult conversation with Zelenskyy. The important thing for America here is, first of all, it does not want to put its own interests at risk. And secondly, it does not want to lead to any higher expenditures on material to fight a war in Ukraine. I think that from Trump's perspective, Ukraine does not matter to the United States, whereas Russia matters a lot. And I don't believe that Trump is at all concerned about whether Russia comes out of this in a better and stronger position than it was when it began it. I think what matters to Trump is that the interests of the United States are protected and that Europe should bear a much heavier burden in meeting its own defence needs. So in all of this, I think there are going to be losers, and it's hard at this point to see where the winners are.
Understood, Allan. We do have to leave it there. We thank you so much for your time and for your thoughts. Allan Behm is Senior Advisor at the International and Security Affairs Program at the Australia Institute.